Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. The night air at the port of Newark had that metallic tang of wet steel, salt water, and diesel exhaust. It had rained earlier, and the asphalt under my boots was still slick, reflecting the towering floodlights that hung off rust-flecked cranes. My shift was almost over, but the overtime hours were too good to pass up, so I'd stayed behind with a skeleton crew to finish unloading a Maersk vessel that had arrived late from the Atlantic. The manifest had been a mess. Half the containers weren't logged properly, and some paperwork was missing entirely. That wasn't unusual in my line of work. Misfiled manifests, lost containers, and cryptic shipping codes were the background noise of the job. I'm Michael Rourke, dockworker, 38, a decade into this life. Before this, I'd bounced around from construction to short-haul trucking. But working the docks paid steady, and I liked the way the cranes silhouetted against the skyline at night. The crew tonight was small: Tommy Boston Callahan, a wiry guy with a mouth that never shut; Hector Diaz, forklift operator with forearms like iron pipes; and Kim Nguyen, our crane operator, who'd been working maritime logistics since before I'd even left high school. Kim ran the big rig with surgical precision, swinging 40-foot containers like they were toys. We also had Rick, the port security officer, a former Coast Guard man who never smiled unless he was talking about boats. It was Kim who first noticed the problem. She was up in the crane cab, moving a weather-beaten 40-footer off the stack when she radioed down to us. "Mike, you see this? Container KRU 8271. There's something weird with it." I stepped out from under the gantry and looked up. The container she was holding was old, paint faded to a dull red, rust streaking the corners. But it wasn't the age that caught my attention. The whole thing was vibrating. Not just a shiver from the crane's motion, but a deep, irregular thud that carried through the steel frame and into the air. The sound came in bursts, 3 or 4 knocks, then silence, then a heavier slam like something big had hit the inside wall. Boston whistled low. "You got a stowaway in there?" "Or a couple of them," Hector added, wiping rain from his face. I frowned. Stowaways happened, sure, but I'd never seen anyone try to punch their way out of a sealed steel box. I grabbed my radio. "Kim, bring it down. Set it on the inspection bay." She lowered it slowly, the gantry cables creaking in the damp air. The container hit the asphalt with a muted metallic thump, still rattling faintly. The port lights threw long shadows over it, highlighting streaks of salt corrosion along the sides. Rick walked over, his flashlight beam cutting across the markings. "Origins Busan, Korea. Last registered transfer in Vladivostok. That's a hell of a route." He tapped the locking bars. That's when we saw it. No padlock, no customs seal. The doors were welded shut along the seam with thick beads of metal. Sloppy work too, like whoever did it was in a hurry. Boston stepped back. "Why the hell would someone weld it? You can lock these things in seconds." Rick's jaw tightened. "Could be smuggling, could be hazardous cargo, could be both. We follow procedure, notify customs, wait for an inspection team." But the radio reception was garbage tonight. Half the yard's comms were down due to the storm earlier. Rick managed to get a scratchy line to the gatehouse, but they said the customs night team was tied up with a container fire on the south pier. Could be an hour before they reached us. We stood there listening. The noise inside had stopped. I stepped closer, pressing my ear to the cold steel. At first, nothing, just the distant hum of ship engines. Then, faintly, something scraped along the floor inside, slow and deliberate. Hector shook his head. "I don't like this, man. If it's chemical stuff, we don't want to be breathing it in when that thing opens." Rick was already pulling on gloves. "We don't open it unless we have to. But I need to know if this is a safety hazard. Mike, Boston, help me check the sides for breaches. Hector, Keep the forklift ready in case we need to move it fast. We walked the perimeter, our boots splashing through shallow puddles. The container's ID plate was scuffed, but still legible. Manufactured 1999. Maximum gross weight 30,480 kilograms. No vent holes, no obvious leaks. On the far side, I spotted something odd. One of the side panels had a small inward dent, about the size of a dinner plate, with flakes of rust and paint scattered on the asphalt below. The dent was fresh, the steel edges were still sharp. Something hit this from the inside, I said. Boston's expression shifted from amused to uneasy. Man, I've seen enough horror movies to know we should just chuck this thing back into the ocean. Rick shot him a look. This is real life. We're not chucking 30 metric tons of someone's property into the bay. But then the container shook. Not a gentle sway. A full, violent shudder that made the steel groan and the welded seams screech under strain. I stepped back instinctively, my hand tightening on the flashlight. The sound from inside was no longer hesitant. It was pounding, fast, irregular, like something had gone into a frenzy. Kim's voice crackled over the crane radio. Guys, I'm watching from up here. That's not normal movement. What's in there?" We didn't answer. Rick barked for everyone to stand clear. He keyed his handheld, trying again to reach the gatehouse. The pounding stopped abruptly. Silence. Just the hiss of rain starting again. That silence felt worse than the noise. Then came a sound I'll never forget. A high, metallic tearing as part of the weld split under pressure. A thin line of darkness appeared between the doors. From it came a smell that made my stomach turn. Rot and something acrid, like ammonia. Rick swore under his breath. "We're done waiting. I'm calling this in as an emergency." But the split widened before he could finish. The first shape that came through wasn't human, not in the way I recognized. It moved wrong, too fast, slamming the doors outward with a screech of tortured hinges. I only saw it for a second under the floodlight. Pale skin stretched tight, jaw slack, eyes milky in the glare, clothes torn and stained. Then it was out, hitting the wet asphalt with a sound like meat dropped on concrete. It scrambled toward us on all fours, and before I could even raise my voice, Rick drew his sidearm, a standard issue Sig Sauer P229, and fired twice. The shots cracked sharp in the night, echoing off the stacked containers. The thing dropped, twitched once, then went still. We stood frozen. The creature lay face down on the wet asphalt, steam rising from its body in the cold air. For a moment, the only sound was the rain pattering on the container's roof and the distant thrum of a ship's generators. The stench coming from the open doors was stronger now, sour and heavy, clinging to the back of my throat. Rick kept his pistol leveled, eyes locked on the fallen shape, waiting for the twitching to stop completely before stepping closer. From inside the container, there came a different sound, less frantic than before, but constant. A shuffling, uneven rhythm, like feet dragging across a steel floor. No words, no calls for help, just that dragging sound mixed with occasional dull impacts against the walls. Hector climbed into the forklift, reversing it a few feet to give us a clear path if we needed to run. The engine's low diesel rumble filled the space between those noises, but it didn't drown them out. Kim's voice came over the radio, lower and tighter than before, telling us she had a clear overhead view and that more movement was visible inside. Rick looked at me. "We don't get closer until we know what we're looking at." Mike grabbed the mag light from the tool chest. I jogged the short distance to the maintenance shed at the edge of the inspection bay. The big industrial flashlight was heavy in my hand when I returned. Rick stepped up just far enough to angle the beam into the container. The light cut through the interior gloom, showing stacked wooden pallets along the walls, some of them broken. A large spill of dried dark material smeared across the floor. Near the back, 3 figures stood in the light's reach, still as statues, faces tilted toward the door, eyes reflecting faintly like an animal's in headlights. Their clothes were torn in places, but looked like standard workwear. Shipping overalls, a hooded jacket, All three were barefoot, skin pale and patchy, mouths slightly open. The smell was clearly coming from them. One of them stepped forward into the light, and I saw that its lower jaw didn't move when it walked, hanging loose in a way that made my stomach tighten. Rick lowered the beam, just enough to keep it out of their eyes. "These people are sick. We hold position. No one gets close." His voice was steady, but there was an edge there now. The first one broke into a run without warning, bare feet slapping the steel floor before it leapt from the container with a sound that didn't belong in any human throat. Rick fired again, 2 shots to the torso, but it didn't slow until the third hit took it in the head and dropped it mid-stride. The other 2 surged forward right after. Boston grabbed a length of steel pipe from the nearby scrap bin and swung it hard at the first that reached him, the impact ringing like a gong. It went down, but even on the ground it clawed toward his legs until Rick finished it with another shot. The last one was on me before I could back away. I brought up the flashlight with both hands and smashed it across the side of its head. The light cracked but stayed on. The figure stumbled, giving Rick a clear angle to put it down. The echo of the last shot rolled across the yard. Then came more noise from inside the container. More than 3, more than 5. The shuffling was a steady advance now, accompanied by guttural, wet sounds. Hector revved the forklift and shouted for us to clear the way. Rick holstered his sidearm and ordered him to use the forks to push the container's doors shut. Hector hit the throttle, the forklift jolting forward, forks angled to press against the metal panels. He shoved hard, forcing the doors partly closed, despite the resistance from inside. Something slammed into them from within, a heavy thud that pushed back against the machine. The welds on one side had already been torn, and the opposite door was starting to buckle where the locking bar was bent. Rick yelled for Hector to back up, then come in at a steeper angle. On the second try, the forks met with enough force to slam the doors fully shut, though the bent metal meant they wouldn't seal perfectly. Boston grabbed a length of chain from the maintenance shed, and together we looped it around the door handles, tightening it with a cargo binder until the steel creaked. The pounding from inside didn't stop. It became a steady assault, metal groaning under each hit. Rick turned toward me and Boston, his voice firm and clipped. "We need to get this container isolated. Now. South Pier quarantine pad. Nobody goes near it until we've got proper hazmat on site." Kim had already rotated the crane arm above, ready to hook the container. Her movements were fast, deliberate, no wasted motion. Hector reversed the forklift to give her space while Boston and I stepped back behind the safety line. The hook descended, and Kim locked it onto the container's corner castings. As she lifted it, the whole unit shuddered violently, banging from inside, echoing against the metal like a drum line. The rain was coming harder now, blowing sideways, making the yard's lights look hazy. Kim began the slow traverse toward the quarantine pad at the far end of the pier. Rick stayed close to the load, walking just ahead, hand on his radio, even though reception was still poor. Every so often, a hollow boom would sound as something inside slammed into the wall. We were halfway there when a sharp metallic snap echoed across the yard. One of the corner castings sheared off, rusted through from years of salt exposure. The container tilted sharply, hanging by the other 3 points, and the damaged door side dipped toward the ground. The pounding from inside reached a frenzy, and the chain binding the doors began to slip loose from the bent handles. Rick yelled for Kim to lower it, but before she could, the chain tore free entirely. The right-hand door swung wide, and figures spilled out. Not 3 or 4, but a dozen or more, tumbling and rolling onto the asphalt before scrambling to their feet with unnatural speed. We didn't have a formation, no plan, just raw instinct. Rick emptied the rest of his magazine into the first wave, each shot precise despite the chaos. Boston swung his pipe like he was breaking concrete, taking one down with a crack to the temple. Hector used the forklift as a moving wall, ramming into any that got too close. I grabbed a pry bar from the nearest pallet stack and kept it between me and the nearest figure, jabbing hard into its midsection before sidestepping to avoid its grasp. They didn't move like people. Every motion was abrupt, driven by sheer force, no hesitation at injury or pain. Blood loss didn't seem to slow them. The only thing that stopped them was catastrophic damage. Broken spine, crushed skull, or worse. The fight lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like 10 minutes. By the end, half a dozen lay still on the ground, steam rising from their bodies in the cold rain. The rest had scattered into the maze of containers, disappearing between rows before we could regroup. Rick stood in the center of the bay, chest rising and falling hard, pistol empty at his side. "We've got a breach," he said, voice steady but grim. "Seal the yard entrances, now. Nobody leaves until we know where they went." Boston spat rainwater and looked toward the dark lanes between the stacks. And what if they're not the only ones? The question hung in the wet night air, unanswered. Rick's order cut through the rain as clearly as the gunshots had moments before. Even before the words finished leaving his mouth, Hector was already climbing into the forklift again, reversing toward the nearest gate control. The machine's beacon light began strobing through the mist, throwing quick flashes over the slick ground. Kim was still up in the crane cab, hands steady on the controls, scanning the yard from her elevated vantage point. She keyed her radio to the gatehouse, but the static was bad enough that most of her message dissolved into noise. The port of Newark wasn't just a handful of stacks and cranes. It was a sprawling, 24-hour industrial labyrinth. Steel corridors formed by stacked containers stretched hundreds of meters in every direction, some barely wide enough for a forklift to pass through. Beyond that, there were service sheds, customs offices, and the dark, silent hulks of anchored cargo ships looming at the piers. Under normal circumstances, security checkpoints were spread across the yard's perimeter, with heavy sliding gates and surveillance coverage. Tonight, with the storm knocking out half the electronics, the system was patchy at best. Rick knew it. He started moving before anyone else had to be told, heading toward the nearest vehicle bay to reload. I followed him inside, shaking the water from my jacket, my grip still tight around the pry bar I'd been using. The security locker was open, an organized row of gear along one wall, 2 more sidearms in holsters, a pair of pump-action shotguns for marine patrols, radios, high-powered flashlights, and a scattering of less lethal equipment like batons and pepper spray canisters. Rick ignored the latter. He loaded his SIG quickly, chambered a round, then slung one of the shotguns over his shoulder. He offered me the other. I'd handled firearms before. Construction sites in rough neighborhoods had a way of teaching you more about self-defense than you ever wanted to know. But I wasn't a marksman. Still, the weight of the Remington 870 felt reassuring. I racked it once, the action clacking loud in the confined space, and slung it across my back for now. Boston came in behind us, soaked and pale, but still gripping the steel pipe like it was welded to his hands. We didn't waste time regrouping. Outside, the yard was quieter now, except for the rain, which had settled into a steady curtain. That quiet was worse than the pounding from the container had been. Somewhere out there, half a dozen figures were moving through the maze, and every second we couldn't see them was another second they could be anywhere. Hector managed to get one of the sliding gates shut, the steel panel grinding on its track before slamming home with a reverberating clang. Across the yard, the gatehouse was flashing its hazard lights, which meant the perimeter sweep was in progress. Security vehicles, white Ford Explorers with Port Authority stenciled on the side, moved slowly between the stacks, spotlights raking the wet asphalt. Rick led our group toward the last direction we'd seen the creatures scatter. That was west, toward a section of the yard where older containers were kept waiting for customs clearance. These weren't stacked neatly. Some were angled, others set on uneven asphalt, with gaps just wide enough for a person to slip through. Puddles filled the low spots, shimmering in the overhead lights. The place smelled of rust, diesel, and something else lingering in the damp air, an echo of the foul odor from the container. We kept our movements tight, checking each intersection before crossing. Rick's voice was low and precise when he spoke, giving hand signals more often than words. Kim's voice occasionally crackled over the radio, reporting glimpses from her crane vantage point, though she admitted visibility was bad between the stacks. Twice she thought she saw movement, but by the time we got there, the lanes were empty. We found the first body 10 minutes into the sweep. It was sprawled against a container corner, face down in a puddle, the back of its head crushed in from what looked like a forklift impact. Its limbs were twisted at impossible angles, yet the muscles still twitched faintly under the skin. Rick didn't hesitate. One clean shot to the base of the skull ended it fully. The sound echoed, and the rain seemed to grow louder in the moment after. Hector called out from the next row over, voice tense. We rounded the corner and saw him standing by another container, this one marked with Chinese export codes. A dark smear trailed from its base toward a narrow alley formed by two leaning stacks. Boston moved to follow it, but Rick stopped him with an outstretched hand. "We go slow," he said. "Corners are kill zones." I took point on that one, shotgun raised, and stepped into the alley. The walls on either side rose almost 20 feet, the space between barely 3 feet wide. The smear ended halfway down, and that's when I heard the sound. Low, wet breathing from somewhere above. I tilted the maglite upward and caught the reflection of eyes staring down at me from atop the left-hand container. The figure crouched there like it had been waiting. It dropped before I could fire, landing hard enough to rattle the steel under our feet. It came up fast, and I pulled the trigger at almost point-blank range. The blast tore into its chest, the recoil punching my shoulder. It staggered but didn't go down, clawing at the shotgun's barrel until Rick put 2 more rounds into its head. It collapsed in the puddle, twitching once before going still. That encounter put everyone on edge. The rest of the sweep was slower, every noise amplified in our heads. We found 2 more, one pinned under a collapsed pallet stack, the other in the shadows near the maintenance rail spur. Both were dispatched quickly, but the remaining figures from the breach were still unaccounted for. When we finally reached the western perimeter, we found fresh signs that at least some of them had made it farther than we thought. One of the older gates here was bent inward at the base. The steel warped as if something had hit it repeatedly until it gave. Beyond that gate was the access road to the fuel storage area, and past that, the dark expanse of the bay itself. Rick stared at the damage for a long moment, then keyed his radio to the gatehouse. His voice was calm but absolute when he said, "We have a perimeter compromise. Lock down fuel depot access and notify Coast Guard. No vessels leave port until further notice." The reply was a burst of static and a garbled acknowledgement. The implications hung unspoken between us. If these things got beyond the yard's perimeter, containment wouldn't be our problem anymore. It would be the city's, and Newark wasn't built for this. Rick turned back to us, water dripping from his cap's brim. "We keep sweeping. No one rests until we're certain this yard is clear." His tone left no room for argument. I tightened my grip on the shotgun and followed him back into the maze, the rain hiding the sound of whatever was still moving out there. The rain had worked its way through my jacket and down my back, soaking the collar of my shirt, but I hardly noticed. Every sense was tuned to the yard. The echo of footsteps on wet steel, the flicker of security lights through the mist, the dull thrum of a ship's engines in the distance. Rick's order kept us moving, our boots slapping through shallow puddles as we pushed deeper into the northwest sector. This section of the yard was older and less organized. Containers were stacked at irregular heights, some tilted from years of settling into the asphalt. The storm had knocked out several of the floodlights here, so the only illumination came from our handheld beams and the occasional sweep of a security vehicle's spotlight in the far lanes. It was a place where shadows lingered and sounds seemed to carry differently, dull and close, like the steel walls were pressing in. We moved in staggered formation, Rick on point, Boston covering the left flank, me covering the right, and Hector bringing up the rear with his forklift in low gear. The diesel engine idled like a steady heartbeat, its rumble grounding us in the silence. Every now and then, Kim's voice broke through the static on the radio from her crane perch, giving us vague updates on movement she thought she'd spotted, though half the time it was impossible to tell if she was seeing people or wind-whipped debris. The first sign that we were heading toward trouble came in the form of a smear on the ground. A long, irregular trail of something darker than rainwater, winding between the stacks toward the far fence line. It wasn't blood in the fresh sense. It had a darker, almost tar-like sheen, as if it had been exposed to air for hours before the rain hit it. Boston crouched to take a closer look, but Rick motioned him back. Whatever it was leading us somewhere, and we didn't want to be bent over when we got there. The trail ended in front of a container set slightly apart from the others, its paint a faded green and marked with Cyrillic letters stenciled in white. I didn't recognize the shipping line. The doors were closed, but unlike the last one, this container wasn't welded shut. The locking bars were in place, secured by a thick custom seal, a red plastic tag stamped with an inspection code and a date from 3 weeks ago. Rick examined it, his flashlight beam tracing over the door edges. The steel bore faint dents, as though something had struck it from the inside, but nothing as severe as the first welded container. He stepped back, scanning the area. "If this one's like the last, we're not opening it here," he said, his tone low but certain. Before we could move it, a metallic clang echoed from somewhere above us. I swung my light upward in time to catch a glimpse of movement, fast, almost spider-like, darting from the top of one stack to another. The beam caught pale skin and the faint glint of wet eyes before it vanished. We tightened formation, shifting so the forklift was between us and the shadows. Rick keyed his radio to the nearest security patrol, requesting a sweep of the adjacent lanes. Static answered him, followed by a broken acknowledgement. We'd be on our own for at least a few minutes. The sound came again, this time from the far side of the green container, followed by a sharp, metallic scrape. I moved with Boston around the right flank while Rick took the left. As we rounded the corner, our lights cut across the source. 2 figures hunched over the locking bar, hands scrabbling at the seal with jerky determination. They froze for a split second in the beam, then launched forward without hesitation. Boston swung his steel pipe in a low arc, catching the first across the legs and sending it sprawling. The second came at me head-on, and I brought the shotgun up, firing once. The blast threw it back into the container's side, where it slid down in a heap. The first one was already pushing itself up, despite its leg bending at a grotesque angle. Rick's voice came sharp from the other side as he rounded the corner and finished it with a clean shot. The seal on the container was gone, broken during the struggle. One of the locking bars hung loose, the other still in place. From within came the faintest sound. So quiet, I almost thought it was the rain tricking my ears. It wasn't the pounding from before. It was softer, more rhythmic, breathing. Rick didn't waste time. "Hector, hook it and lift. We're taking this to the quarantine pad now." Hector moved the forklift into position, inserting the forks into the side slots near the container's base. As he lifted, the steel creaked and the breathing inside quickened. The sound became a low, steady thumping, like fists pressing, not slamming, against the walls. It was enough to make my grip tighten on the shotgun's stock. We moved with purpose, escorting Hector as he drove the container toward the far pier. The rain was heavier now, the wind pushing it sideways so that it stung when it hit your face. The floodlights at the quarantine pad flickered but held, throwing stark white light over the slick asphalt. Rick ordered it set down with the door facing the bay, away from the yard. Before we could secure it, Kim's voice broke through the radio, clearer than before. "Multiple contacts moving towards your position, west side of the pad, at least 6. Rick swore under his breath and turned to face the approach. Figures emerged from between the stacks, moving at a loping, uneven run. Their silhouettes were irregular, some hunched, others with arms hanging low, as if joints no longer worked right. The lead one let out a guttural noise, and the rest surged forward. The fight was fast and ugly. Boston caught one in the ribs with his pipe and used the rebound to swing at another's head. I fired twice, the blasts lighting the rain in brief flashes. Rick's shotgun boomed beside me, each shot deliberate and effective. Hector kept the forklift between us and the bulk of the group, using the heavy machine to knock them off balance or pin them against the container stacks. By the time the last one hit the ground, the pad was littered with motionless shapes, steam rising from their bodies in the cold night air. The container sat untouched, but the sounds from within had changed. No longer just breathing, but a steady, building pounding, as if whatever was inside had been roused by the noise. Rick stood with his shotgun at the ready, eyes on the doors. "If we open that," he said, "we'd better be ready for whatever comes out, because I don't think this one was meant to stay closed either." The pounding inside the container shifted from an uneven rhythm to a steady, deliberate assault. Each impact resonating through the steel like the toll of a heavy bell. The doors flexed with every blow, the locking bar on the remaining side rattling violently. Rick kept his shotgun leveled, eyes fixed on the seam, his stance squared against the recoil that would come if he had to fire in close quarters. The emergency horn from the moored ship sounded again in the distance, deeper and slower this time, echoing across the wet expanse of the pier. Somewhere behind us, the diesel whine of approaching vehicles grew louder. Security units and maintenance trucks converging on the pad. Floodlights from their roofs cut wide arcs across the rain, throwing fractured beams through the mist. The yard was coming alive now, but not in the way it should. This wasn't normal response protocol. This was scramble mode. Kim's voice came over the radio from the crane tower, her tone clipped and urgent. She'd spotted movement across the container stacks on the eastern approach, multiple figures, too fast and erratic for workers caught in the weather. That meant this pad wasn't just about to have a problem from the inside, it was going to be squeezed from both sides. The first breach came as a metallic shriek. The locking bar on the secured side tore out of its seat. The door bent outward a fraction, enough for a thin wedge of dark to appear between the panels. A hand, or what had once been one, forced through the gap, fingers clawing blindly at the air. Skin pale and mottled, nails blackened, the wrist twisting at an unnatural angle. The pounding intensified, the steel groaning under the strain. Rick gave the order without looking away from the container. "Form a line. Do not let anything pass this pad." His voice was low but carried weight, the kind of tone you didn't ignore even with adrenaline driving your pulse. Boston took position to my left, pipe held low and ready. Hector climbed down from the forklift, retrieving a crowbar from the tool rack, his face grim but set. The door blew open with a single concussive strike from within, slamming into the side of the forklift with enough force to dent the panel. The first figure through moved on all fours, its limbs contorting to push it faster than seemed possible. The shotgun barked in Rick's hands, the blast tearing into its chest and flipping it backward into the container's frame. But there was no pause. The next two were already spilling out, then four more behind them. The fight collapsed into a brutal, point-blank melee. My first shot took the lead one in the head, the recoil jarring my arms, the sound deafening in the confined space between the container stacks. Boston's pipe caught another across the jaw, sending teeth scattering against the asphalt. Hector used his crowbar like a spear, driving it through the collarbone of one that had lunged for him. Rick moved methodically, each shot clean, conserving ammunition with the precision of someone who'd been under fire before. Even as we dropped them, more pushed out from inside. The container was deeper than it looked. They kept coming in a relentless surge, slipping in the rain, rising again like nothing had broken. One of them, taller than the rest, barreled straight for the forklift, smashing into its side hard enough to rock it on its suspension. The machine teetered but held. Behind us, the approaching security convoy broke into the pad. Engines roared, spotlights flared, and within seconds, a half-dozen officers in rain-dark uniforms were moving up in a rough skirmish line, weapons ready. Their rifles, 5.56 mm.4 carbines, cracked in sharp bursts, the muzzle flashes strobing through the rain. The creatures dropped under the incoming fire, some instantly, others only after multiple hits. For a brief, unreal moment, the pad was a chaos of light, noise and movement, diesel exhaust mixing with the smell of spent gunpowder and the heavier, rotting stench that clung to everything from that container. The floodlights cast stark, unnatural shadows against the steel walls, turning the melee into something almost surreal. When the last of them fell, the silence was so sudden it felt wrong. Rain hammered the asphalt, water running in rivulets toward the pier's edge. The container's interior was now visible, lit by one of the officers' flashlights. It was bare steel inside except for a row of bolted-down benches along one wall, and heavy rings welded into the floor. Chains lay scattered across it, some broken, others still locked in place. Whatever had been in there had once been restrained, and by the look of the deep scoring on the walls, they'd been trying to get out long before we ever touched the seal. Rick didn't speak for a long moment, just studied the interior with the grim expression of a man adding up pieces he didn't like. Finally, he turned to the ranking officer among the security team, a tall man with a Coast Guard patch on his jacket who'd arrived with the convoy. They spoke in low tones that I couldn't hear over the rain, but the Coast Guard man kept glancing toward the container and then toward the bay. Kim came down from her crane at last, jogging across the slick asphalt to join us. She'd seen more from her height than any of us, and the first thing she said made the hair on my neck stand up. "There's another one," she told Rick. "Bigger, same markings, out past the west stacks near the waterline. It's already on a flatbed." The Coast Guard officer heard her and cut in sharply. "If that load reaches the docks, it leaves the port. If it leaves the port..." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. Everyone here understood the implication. Rick shouldered his shotgun, rain running off the brim of his cap. "Then we stop it here," he said, and started moving toward the west stacks without waiting for an answer. I followed, shotgun heavy in my hands, the image of those chained benches burning in my mind. Whatever had been in that container wasn't unique, and somewhere ahead, another load was already in motion. We advanced through the narrow corridor formed by the stacked containers, our boots slapping against the wet asphalt. The rain had tapered off to a mist, but the air was heavy and close, trapping every metallic clang and hollow thud in a kind of echo chamber. The light from our flashlights swept over painted serial numbers, peeling hazard labels and streaks of rust. I could feel the tension radiating from the men around me. No chatter now, no nervous jokes. Just the quiet discipline of people who understood they were walking towards something they didn't fully grasp. Rick led the way, his shotgun's barrel steady, scanning each shadowed gap. Marco brought up the rear with the M4, occasionally glancing over his shoulder, the motion too frequent to be casual. It wasn't paranoia anymore, it was procedure. We reached the far end of the yard, where the containers formed a dead-end wall against the perimeter fence. A single floodlight mounted high on a crane sputtered weakly, flickering across a row of red steel boxes. One of them stood slightly ajar, the heavy doors drawn together but not latched, as if someone had pulled them shut in a hurry and left them. The paint on the right door was scraped raw near the latch plate, as though a crowbar, or claws, had raked across it. Rick motioned us into position, splitting the group so we had angles on both sides. My pulse was loud in my ears, but my hands stayed steady. We had already seen what one of these things could do when it came charging out. Rick crouched, inspected the latch with the muzzle of his shotgun, then gave me a glance that was more a signal than a question. I stepped up beside him, bracing the shotgun against my shoulder. Marco's M4 was aimed over my head from the side, and Evans stood back with the flashlight trained on the seam between the doors. Rick counted down silently with his fingers. 3, 2, 1, then yanked the right door open in a single motion and stepped back. The smell hit us first. Stale, damp air with an acrid undertone of rot and oil. Inside, the beam of Evans's light cut across a cluttered interior. Stacks of wooden pallets, tarped bundles strapped with heavy cargo bands, and a spillage of loose canvas bags along the floor. The walls were lined with metal brackets, some bent or torn away. One of the tarps near the back twitched. I kept the shotgun trained dead center as Rick moved in, sweeping the barrel left and right. He gave the tarp a sharp kick with his boot, and a rat bolted out, disappearing between two pallets. My body wanted to relax, But the scene was too wrong. Every tarp, every bundle looked like it could hide something that wasn't supposed to be here. Evan stepped inside, light dancing over the walls. "Nothing fresh," he muttered. "But this setup, this isn't normal cargo." He wasn't wrong. The straps on the bundles were reinforced with steel cable, and the pallets themselves had been bolted down to the container floor. That wasn't standard for consumer goods. That was the kind of modification you made when you didn't want something moving, no matter how hard it tried. Rick motioned us back out. "We'll tag it for inspection," he said quietly. "But this one's cold. Let's move." As we backed away, I caught myself glancing at the narrow gaps between containers again. The thought of something slipping silently between those rows, bypassing our whole sweep, made my skin crawl. The cranes loomed overhead like skeletal watchtowers, their massive hooks swaying slightly in the breeze, cables creaking. Somewhere beyond them, a faint metallic clatter echoed, like a container door shifting against its hinges. We froze in place, listening. It came again, this time followed by a muffled thud. Rick didn't need to say anything. We all pivoted toward the sound, weapons up. The noise led us toward the southern edge of the yard, where a series of older, weathered containers sat under the shadow of the main loading gantry. The asphalt here was slick with standing water, and the tracks for the crane's wheels formed shallow channels across our path. The sound grew sharper as we approached, now clearly the rattle of something hitting steel from the inside. One of the containers had its identification numbers obscured under layers of grime, but its doors were reinforced with a secondary set of horizontal locking bars, the kind normally used for high-value cargo. Those bars, thick as my wrist, were vibrating in their mounts. Rick raised a fist, halting the group. "This one," he said in a low voice. "Something's in there, and it's still moving." He moved to one side of the door, positioning himself for cover. I mirrored him on the other side, shotgun up. The pounding inside intensified, accompanied now by a sound that was almost, but not quite, human. A strained, guttural exhalation between impacts, like something pushing itself to the limit against its confinement. We didn't open it, not then. Rick keyed his radio and called for the yard's maintenance crew to bring the welding gear back online. If this box had been sealed for a reason, we weren't about to undo someone else's precautions without knowing what we were facing. As we waited, I watched the locking bars shudder with each blow from inside, feeling the reverberation through the asphalt under my boots. The rational part of my mind told me to keep my weapon trained, to focus on the mechanics of the job. But the deeper instinct, the one that had been gnawing at me since we cracked the first container, whispered something else entirely. Whatever we were holding back here wasn't cargo. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.